So this is our second lesson, Year 9, in our new topic of the First World War. To start this lesson, I would like you to imagine that you are in the army and you've got to encourage other men to come with you and to fight. How are you going to do that? Can you please list as many reasons as you can into your books? So this lesson, we are going to be looking at signing up and conscription. So again, this lesson is going to be looking into whether the First World War was an unnecessary war. Throughout this lesson, I'm hoping that all of you will be able to describe why the government moved from voluntary enlistment to conscription. I'm hoping that most of you will be able to explain why the government moved from voluntary enlistment to conscription. And I'm hoping some of you will be able to justify some reasons why men chose to enlist. So, first of all, we are going to be watching a video that is talking about the move from volunteering to conscription. What I would like you to do is, while you are watching this video, I'd like you to choose one of the questions to answer. As always, the bronze question is the easiest question for you to choose to answer. So this question, I would like you to be considering what ideas united people supporting the war effort. The silver question is slightly more difficult, but I still believe that most of you will be able to answer it. I'd like you to be thinking about how the rules of conscription were relaxed in 1918. And lastly, the gold question. Slightly more difficult again, but I'm expecting some of you to be able to answer this one. About what impact did conscription have on preparations for the Second World War?
When the First World War broke out 100 years ago, most people in Britain put aside their differences to support the war effort. United by a sense of patriotism, duty, and the shock of war, hundreds of thousands of men across Britain and the Empire volunteered to fight.
When the war started in 1914, Britain was actually had a very small army and needed to expand it very, very quickly. Initially, that was done on a voluntary basis. And actually thousands of men volunteered in the opening months of the war and through into 1915.
Millions of people at home volunteered their time and money to support troops as they feared what might happen if Germany won. While initially most Britons needed little persuading to play their part in their country's cause, the government churned out around 12.5 million recruitment posters in over 160 designs. Despite the vivacious volunteer effort, the sheer size and scale of World War I meant that conscription came into force. 7 million men marched off to war in August 1914, but 1 million of them died by the end of the year. The horrific number of casualties caused by modern weapons came as a terrible shock, while the British Expeditionary Force, or the BEF, the core of Britain's small army, was almost destroyed.
As 1915 drew on, it became clear that the number of recruits into the armed forces wasn't enough for this, what was an absolutely huge war effort. And so towards the end of 1915, there was an initial scheme called the Derby Scheme, which is, again, encouraging men to join up, but it was kind of a halfway house between full conscription. But that wasn't effective particularly either. So full conscription came in at the very beginning of 1916, started to take effect in the spring and summer of 1916. And it was really important to enable Britain to have armed forces that were big enough to maintain what was a really enormous war effort in a really desperate struggle, particularly on the Western Front, which required huge numbers of men and obviously huge amounts of material as well.
In 1916, over 1 million British and Empire troops were evacuated from the Western Front to Britain for medical treatment, and 250,000 of them had already suffered partial or total amputation of an arm or leg. Meanwhile, Britain roped in unlikely help in the war effort, such as over 1 million Indian men to help fight the war, and hundreds of thousands of women to help become farm labourers and work in other forms of manual employment in the forces for more support. But it was the adoption of conscription that was dominating the use of manpower.
Conscription was something that was very alien to Britain as a country. It was something that had never happened in Britain before, which was in complete contrast to most of the other major powers in Europe. In terms of how it actually worked, there was a restricted age range for soldiers. So men between about 18 and 41 years of age were conscripted. They were conscripted in different classes according to when they were born, and so that affected when they would be called up. The actual age restrictions were slightly relaxed in 1918 when there were manpower problems, when the army was really desperate for new conscripts to keep it at a reasonable level of manpower. And so actually soldiers before were only supposed to serve overseas when they turned 19. But in 1918 that was slightly lowered to 18 years old. And also the age range at the top of the scale was slightly extended as well. So it just showed how desperate the war effort had become by that point, that the age ranges were widened.
Not only did World War I change the way Britain formed its armed forces, but it also shaped the way Britain drew in new recruits for World War II.
Well, in the Second World War, it affected things in the sense that conscription came in as soon as the war started. So voluntary recruitment wasn't an issue because there was no need for it. Conscription was there from the word go, so it was an entirely different sort of situation. I think by the time of the Second World War, people, the two world wars were relatively close together. So, some people who had served in the First World War were also involved in some capacity during the Second as well. For example, a lot of service personnel who might have been too old to actually serve in the armed forces by the time of the Second World War, they would have been in the Home Guard, or they would have been an ARP warden, or done some kind of civil defence role. So people were, I think, very much in a mindset where they knew they could cope to some extent with some kind of massive conflicts, a total war on an even more global scale actually than the First World War. So in some ways, I suppose society was slightly better prepared for such a cataclysmic event. But at the same time, when something has happened so relatively recently in living memory, there's something quite depressing and quite difficult about having to face another long and very costly war.
By the end of the First World War, Britain and its empire were triumphant, but the fallout had reshaped society forever. 88% of British soldiers who went off to fight came home, but some towns and families paid a disproportionately high price. By the end of the 1920s, around 2.5 million war veterans were still receiving a disability pension, while 60,000 British soldiers suffered head or eye injuries. Then, over 41,000 British servicemen lost limbs, while 80,000 cases of war neuroses had been reported by the end of the war. By 1922, around a quarter of the 2 million people out of work were ex-servicemen. This is why, especially to mark the centenary, that society should remember and honour those who sacrificed their lives in one of the most brutal wars in history.
So, propaganda was one of the means that was used to encourage men to sign up during the First World War. So what propaganda means is it is where somebody is persuaded to do something by the media. So in the First World War, this was used as posters. So during times of war, propaganda is used a lot to encourage people to sign up and fight and to agree with the causes of the war. So, can you think of any modern day examples of propaganda? So for our second task, I would like you to look at the two types of propaganda posters that were used during the First World War to encourage men to sign up and fight. So as you can see in the picture on the left, it says, "There is still a place for you there's still a place in the line for you. So it says clearly that this space is reserved for a fit man. Will you fill it? So that is encouraging men to sign up. The second one is your king and country needs you to maintain the honour and glory of the British Empire. So I think, again, our bronze question is a question I think all of you will be able to answer. So describe how these propaganda posters encourage men to enlist. Secondly, our silver question is slightly more difficult. So compare the messages of these two propaganda posters. What is the same about both of these propaganda posters, and what is different? Lastly, to what extent were these propaganda posters effective in encouraging men to enlist? Okay, the third task. On the supporting slides, you will see statements on the cards that are saying people's opinions of whether to go and fight. You need to sort them into two groups. So those who are willing to accept conscription and those who are considered conscientious objectors. A conscientious objector is somebody who does not agree with war, would like peace rather than war, and doesn't agree to fight, usually on religious grounds. So from these cards, once you've sorted them into the two groups, can you identify one reason why some people didn't think compulsory service was right and one reason why you believe it was? In your books and in your own words, write a paragraph about the two different viewpoints. If you finish this and you feel that you wish to challenge yourself, can you tell me about what reasons would give people to become a conscientious objector? And why were so many men happy to go away to fight? So something for you to do in your own time. I would like you to create a speech to encourage a man to sign up to go to war. So you're going to be thinking about the messages in the propaganda pictures and the way in which they were encouraged to fight. So I would like you in your speech to include the reasons for the First World War. Why is it important that the First World War is fought? Secondly, the excitement of war. What is exciting about men going off to war? The opportunity to travel and the opportunity to fight amongst your friends. So, lastly, to finish off then, I'm going to give you the statement that conscription was fairer than voluntary recruitment. Can you please agree, disagree, or neither agree nor disagree with this statement? And please tell me why you have that viewpoint.